Part 1. Whispers in the Dust. The Nazca Desert. A vast canvas of ochre and rust, stretching across the arid plains of southern Peru. Here, etched into the earth, are the enigmatic Nazca Lines. Gigantic geoglyphs, some spanning hundreds of meters, depicting animals, plants, and geometric shapes. They've captivated imaginations for decades, inspiring theories ranging from ancient calendars to elaborate irrigation systems. But what if the true purpose of these colossal creations was something far more extraordinary? What if the Nazca Lines were a message, not to those on the ground, but to something beyond? Something in the sky? The sheer scale of the figures begs the question: why create something so immense that it can only be truly appreciated from high above? From ground level, the lines are little more than shallow trenches in the desert floor, barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. Yet, seen from the air, they transform into intricate, breathtaking works of art. Could the Nazca people, who lived over 1,500 years ago, have possessed the technology to achieve such a perspective? Or did they envision an audience beyond their own earthly limitations? Consider the spider, its legs perfectly articulated, its body accurately proportioned, stretching over 47 meters. Or the hummingbird, frozen mid-flight, its delicate wings spread wide. Then there are the monkey, the condor, the killer whale, each rendered with astonishing precision, their forms etched into the desert pavement with remarkable clarity. These aren't crude sketches or rudimentary doodles. They are sophisticated representations of the natural world, meticulously crafted and executed on a monumental scale. Is it conceivable that such intricate designs were intended to be viewed solely by the human eye from ground level? The precision with which the lines are drawn is equally perplexing. The straight lines, some extending for kilometers, are remarkably straight, deviating by only a few degrees. The curves are smooth and flowing, the angles precise. How did the Nazca people achieve such accuracy without modern surveying equipment? Some theories suggest the use of sophisticated measuring tools and complex mathematical calculations. But the very simplicity of the tools found at Nazca sites raises the possibility of a different kind of knowledge, a different way of seeing. The Nazca culture, while undeniably skilled in pottery and textiles, left behind no written records. Their motivations, their beliefs, their understanding of the cosmos remain shrouded in mystery. We can only speculate about their worldview, their rituals, their connection to the land and the sky. Perhaps the lines themselves hold the key to unlocking these secrets. Perhaps they are a visual language, a testament to a cosmic understanding we can only now begin to comprehend. The possibility of extraterrestrial contact has long been a staple of science fiction, but could it be that evidence of such contact lies hidden in plain sight, etched into the very fabric of our planet? Were the Nazca people attempting to attract the attention of beings from another world, signaling their presence, their knowledge, their hopes and dreams? Or were they simply creating a vast, open-air temple, a sacred space designed to commune with the celestial realm? The desert itself adds another layer of intrigue. The Nazca region is one of the driest places on Earth, receiving less than an inch of rain each year. This aridity has preserved the lines for centuries, shielding them from the erosive forces of wind and water. Was this preservation a deliberate act, a way of ensuring the longevity of the message, its endurance through time? Or is it simply a fortunate coincidence, a quirk of geography that has allowed these enigmatic figures to survive the ravages of time? Looking out across this desolate landscape, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe and wonder. These lines, these figures, they whisper to us from a distant past, a past we can only dimly perceive. They speak of a connection to something larger than ourselves, something beyond our immediate grasp. Were they a plea, a prayer, a message to the heavens? Or were they simply a testament to the boundless creativity of the human spirit, a desire to leave a mark, to inscribe our presence upon the earth, a testament to our existence beneath the watchful gaze of the infinite sky? The questions linger, unanswered, hanging in the air like the dust devils that dance across the desert floor, swirling mysteries in the heart of this ancient land. The humming intensified, vibrating the ground beneath Elisa's boots. The air crackled with a static charge, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. The Nazca spider, viewed from the air, now pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. Not reflected light, but light emitting from the etched stones themselves. It was as if the massive geoglyph was waking up. Back at the research station, Professor Ramirez paced, muttering to himself. They said it was impossible. They said it was just erosion, wind patterns, superstition. He slammed his fist on the table, scattering parchment rubbings of the Nazca monkey and the hummingbird. But the resonance, the damn resonance is off the charts. Elisa keyed her radio. Professor, the spider, it's glowing. Faintly, but definitely glowing. The silence on the other end was thick with static. Then, Ramirez's voice, strained, crackled through. Get out of there, Elisa. Get back to the station. Now. But it was too late. The humming escalated to a low, guttural drone that vibrated deep within Elisa's chest. The ground beneath her began to tremble. The air shimmered, distorting the familiar landscape of the pampas. The spider, now blazing with an eerie green light, seemed to writhe, the etched lines blurring and reforming. The sky, once a clear, vibrant blue, was now a swirling vortex of dark purple and sickly yellow. Terror choked Elisa. She stumbled back, her eyes wide with a primal fear. The world around her felt alien, wrong. This wasn't the Earth she knew. This was something else. Then, the silence. The humming abruptly stopped. The ground stilled. The air cleared. The sky returned to its familiar azure hue. The spider, though still faintly visible, was no longer glowing. It lay inert, a silent testament to the unnatural spectacle Elisa had just witnessed. She stood, rooted to the spot, heart pounding, trying to rationalize what she'd seen. Hallucination? Sunstroke? Mass hysteria? But deep down, she knew none of those explanations fit. She had seen something real. Something other. Slowly, she made her way back to the research station. The jeep felt unfamiliar beneath her hands, the familiar rumble of its engine a comforting sound in the unsettling silence. As she drove, she kept glancing back at the Nazca Plateau, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The lines were there, silent and enigmatic as ever, but now held a sinister meaning she couldn't comprehend. Back at the station, Ramirez was a wreck. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a haunted look. He clutched a seismograph readout, the needle having swung wildly off the chart during the event. Did you see it? He whispered, his voice trembling. Elisa nodded, unable to speak. The resonance, it spiked. Higher than anything I've ever recorded. And then, nothing. He crumpled the readout in his fist. It was like something listened. And then, it answered. The following days were a blur of frantic activity. Ramirez pored over the data, trying to make sense of the inexplicable readings. Elisa tried to document her experience, her written accounts feeling inadequate, failing to capture the sheer terror of the event. The other researchers, initially skeptical, were now unnerved, their easy banter replaced by hushed whispers and anxious glances. Then came the news reports. Strange atmospheric anomalies were being reported across the globe. Unexplained power outages, disrupted radio transmissions, migratory birds flying off course, crashing into buildings. The world seemed to be unraveling at the seams. One evening, Ramirez called Elisa into his office. He looked older, his face etched with a deep fatigue. He pointed to a map of the world, marked with the locations of the recent anomalies. Look, he said, his voice hoarse. They form a pattern. Elisa leaned closer. The markings, scattered across the globe, seemed random at first glance. But as she studied them, a chilling realization dawned. They weren't random, they connected. They formed lines. Giant, sprawling lines that crisscrossed the globe, mirroring the patterns etched into the Nazca Desert. The humming started again, this time fainter, but undeniably there. A low, persistent drone that vibrated not just the ground, but the very air itself. Ramirez and Elisa exchanged a terrified look. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that whatever had listened, was now speaking. And the message was not meant for them. It was meant for something else. Something, in the sky. The humming intensified, resonating deep in our chests, a physical vibration that made my teeth ache. The air itself seemed to thicken, shimmering with an unseen energy. Elena clutched my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. Above, the constellations, normally fixed points of light, began to drift, swirling slowly as if caught in a celestial whirlpool. The familiar patterns fractured and reformed, alien and unsettling. "They're answering," Father Vicente whispered, his voice choked with awe and terror. He made the sign of the cross, but his hand trembled so violently it looked like a blurred flutter. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, a low, guttural growl emanating from the Earth's core. Cracks snaked across the desert floor, radiating out from the monkey geoglyph like shattered glass. Dust devils, born from the disturbed air, danced around us, swirling vortices of red dirt that momentarily obscured the horrifying spectacle unfolding above. Then, the silence. The humming ceased abruptly, the trembling stopped, the dust settled. The silence was so profound, so absolute, that it felt heavier, more oppressive than the cacophony that had preceded it. We were left standing in the eerie stillness, our ears ringing, our hearts pounding, staring up at the distorted constellations. They had formed a new pattern, a vast, intricate design that spanned half the sky. It wasn't random, there was a clear structure, a terrifying symmetry. It resembled an eye. A colossal, cosmic eye, staring down at us with cold indifference. Elena whimpered, burying her face in my shoulder. Father Vicente began to mutter in Latin, his prayers a frantic, desperate plea against the unknown. I, however, felt a strange calm descend upon me, a chilling acceptance of the inevitable. We had asked a question, and the universe had answered. The answer was far beyond our comprehension, beyond our control. The silence stretched on, each second an eternity. Then, a new phenomenon began. From the center of the celestial eye, a single point of light emerged, growing brighter, larger, until it resembled a falling star. But this was no meteor. It descended slowly, deliberately, its light casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor. As it neared, the air around it shimmered and distorted, revealing glimpses of something truly alien. Shapes shifted and pulsed within the light, defying description, defying logic. They were fleeting impressions of vastness, of complexity, of something ancient and powerful beyond human understanding. Terror finally clawed its way through my forced calm. I wanted to run, to scream, to hide, but I was rooted to the spot, mesmerized by the descending light. Elena sobbed uncontrollably, and Father Vicente's Latin prayers turned into incoherent babblings. The light finally touched down a few hundred meters from us, the impact surprisingly gentle. The swirling dust and shimmering light slowly dissipated, revealing nothing. There was no object, no structure, no being. Just a circular area of scorched earth, still radiating heat. The silence returned, heavier, more suffocating than before. We stood there, three figures silhouetted against the backdrop of the distorted constellations and the scorched earth, our breath held captive in our chests. Then, the ground beneath the scorched circle began to glow. A faint, ethereal light pulsed from within the earth, spreading outwards, illuminating the Nazca Lines around it. The lines, etched into the desert floor for centuries, now pulsed with the same otherworldly light, like a giant circuit board coming to life. The humming returned, deeper, more resonant than before. The ground trembled again, but this time with a rhythm, a pulse that matched the humming. The constellations above continued their slow, hypnotic swirl. From the glowing circle, a shape began to emerge. It rose slowly, like a phantom from a grave, its form indistinct, obscured by the shimmering light. It grew taller, wider, taking on a vaguely humanoid form, but impossibly large, dwarfing even the surrounding mountains. Its head tilted towards us, and the celestial eye above seemed to follow its movement. The humming intensified, reaching a crescendo that threatened to shatter our eardrums. The ground shook violently, cracks widening, the earth groaning under the strain. The figure, still indistinct, raised one of its enormous limbs and pointed directly at the monkey geoglyph. A beam of light, blindingly white, shot out from its finger, striking the monkey directly. The geoglyph, etched into the desert for centuries, began to glow, the lines turning a fiery red. The monkey, it seemed, was being activated. And we, the unwitting witnesses, were trapped in the middle of it all. Trapped between the earth and the sky, between the ancient lines and the cosmic eye, caught in a conversation we were never meant to hear, a conversation we now desperately wished we could unhear. We had asked a question, and the universe had answered. Now, the real horror was about to begin. What if the Nazca Lines were meant to communicate with the sky? Part 4 of 25. The wind howled a mournful dirge across the desolate plains, whipping the dust into frenzied spirals that danced around our ankles. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of bruised purple and sickly green, casting long, distorted shadows from the newly discovered geoglyphs. Father Miguel, his face etched with a grim fascination, continued to meticulously sketch the figures in his worn leather-bound notebook. He muttered prayers under his breath, each syllable laced with a tremor of fear. This changes everything, he finally said, his voice barely a whisper above the wind's lament. These are not of God. The newest figures differed significantly from the familiar spider, monkey, and hummingbird. These were grotesque, twisted mockeries of life. One resembled a humanoid form, but with elongated, skeletal limbs and a head that resembled a gaping maw filled with needle-like teeth. Another was a swirling vortex of lines, reminiscent of a diseased eye staring back at the heavens. There was a perverse symmetry to them, a disturbing artistry that spoke of a consciousness far removed from human comprehension. The radio crackled to life, spitting out static and the frantic voice of Professor Ramirez from the base camp. Padre, we've analyzed the soil samples from the new site. The radiation levels, they're off the charts. We're talking Chernobyl levels. You need to evacuate immediately. A chill, colder than the desert wind, snaked down my spine. Chernobyl. The word echoed in my mind, conjuring images of desolation and unseen death. But how? How could ancient geoglyphs emit such lethal radiation? The rational part of my brain screamed for an explanation, for a scientific basis, but a deeper, more primal instinct told me that we were treading on forbidden ground. A place where the laws of physics bent to the whims of something ancient and malevolent. Father Miguel remained unmoved, his gaze fixed on the monstrous figures etched into the earth. We cannot leave, not yet, he insisted, his voice strangely calm. There is something we need to understand. His unwavering resolve unnerved me. The man I had known, the devout, rational priest, was gone, replaced by a zealot driven by a dangerous obsession. I knew I should argue, plead with him to come to his senses, but a strange paralysis gripped me. The desert, the geoglyphs, the oppressive silence broken only by the wind's mournful cry, it all conspired to hold me captive. That night, under the sickly glow of a crescent moon, we set up camp near the newly discovered figures. Sleep eluded me. Every rustle of the wind, every shadow cast by the moon, seemed pregnant with menace. I kept seeing the grotesque figures in my mind's eye, their twisted forms writhing and shifting as if trying to break free from their earthly prison. Father Miguel spent the entire night poring over his notes, muttering to himself in a language I didn't recognize. At times, he would raise his head and stare at the geoglyphs, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling light. He was consumed, possessed by something beyond my comprehension. Just before dawn, as the sky began to lighten, Father Miguel let out a sharp cry. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest. He was pointing at the largest of the geoglyphs, the humanoid figure with the gaping maw. Look, he exclaimed, his voice hoarse with excitement. It's changing. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a figment of his overwrought imagination. But as I stared at the geoglyph, I felt a cold dread wash over me. The lines, etched deep into the earth, seemed to be shifting, pulsating with an unnatural light. The gaping maw appeared to widen, as if about to swallow the world whole. Then, the earth began to tremble. A low rumbling sound echoed through the desert, growing louder with each passing second. The ground beneath our feet buckled and heaved, throwing us to the ground. I looked up at the sky, expecting to see a plane, a helicopter, anything to explain the growing tremors. But the sky was empty, save for a single, luminous point of light that seemed to descend from the heavens, growing larger and brighter with terrifying speed. It was headed straight for us, straight for the monstrous figure etched into the earth. As the light grew closer, I realized it wasn't a single point, but a cluster of lights, arranged in a pattern that mirrored the swirling vortex geoglyph. The air crackled with energy, and the very ground seemed to vibrate with an otherworldly hum. Father Miguel, his face alight with a feverish ecstasy, raised his arms towards the descending lights. "They have answered," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the roar of the approaching, whatever it was. "They have heard our call." And then, the world exploded in a blinding flash of light. The silence that followed Amelia's scream was thicker than the desert air. The static that had plagued our radios intensified, a crackling roar that pressed against our eardrums. We all turned, our headlamps cutting jagged cones through the darkness, searching for the source of her terror. Amelia stood frozen, her face ashen, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond the illumination of our lamps. Her hand trembled, pointing a shaking finger into the black abyss. "There," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the static. "It moved," Javier cursed, his hand going to the machete strapped to his hip. "Moved? What moved?" Amelia swallowed hard. The lines. One of the figures, it shifted. I saw it. We stared. The Nazca Lines, etched into the desert floor for centuries, immutable, unchanging, moving? The very idea was absurd, yet Amelia's fear was palpable, raw. A cold dread began to seep into my own bones. Professor Reyes, usually so stoic, looked genuinely unnerved. "Amelia, are you certain? It could have been a trick of the light, a shadow." "No," she insisted, her voice rising in panic. "I saw it. The hummingbird, its wing, it extended. It wasn't there before, I swear it wasn't." We shone our lights towards the area where the hummingbird geoglyph lay, a vast, stylized bird etched into the earth. It looked exactly as it had before, silent and still under the oppressive night sky. The static on the radios intensified further, now interspersed with bursts of what sounded like distorted whispers. My heart hammered against my ribs. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. The logical part of my brain screamed that it was all in our heads, a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and the oppressive atmosphere of the desert. But the primal, instinctive part whispered of something ancient and unknowable, something watching us from the vast expanse above. Javier agreed. "Let's pack up and head back to base camp. We can re-evaluate in the morning." But as we turned to gather our equipment, a new sound emerged from the static-filled radios, a low, guttural hum that resonated deep within our chests. The ground beneath our feet began to vibrate subtly. The humming grew louder, the vibrations more intense, and the air crackled with an unseen energy. Then, the lights went out. Plunged into absolute darkness, the only sound was the terrifying hum and the erratic pounding of our hearts. The static on the radios reached a deafening crescendo, punctuated by the distorted whispers that now seemed to be all around us, closing in. "Stay together," Javier yelled, his voice strained with fear. We huddled close, our backs pressed together, blindly reaching out to ensure we hadn't lost anyone in the sudden darkness. The ground continued to tremble, the humming now so loud it felt like it was vibrating our very bones. And then, Amelia screamed again. A truly blood-curdling shriek that echoed through the desert night. "It's here," she sobbed, her voice choked with terror. "I can feel it." The humming intensified, and through the darkness, I felt a presence, a vast, incomprehensible something moving towards us. The air grew cold, a bone-chilling cold that seemed to seep into our souls. I could feel the others trembling beside me, their fear as palpable as my own. Then, a faint, ethereal glow began to emanate from the direction of the hummingbird geoglyph. The glow intensified, spreading across the desert floor, revealing a sight that will forever be etched into my memory. The hummingbird was moving. Its vast wing, previously just a line in the earth, had extended, rising into the air like some monstrous, skeletal appendage. Other lines, previously depicting the bird's body, began to shift and rearrange themselves, forming new shapes, new patterns that defied any earthly logic. The geoglyph was no longer static, it was alive. And it was reaching for the sky. The distorted whispers on the radio coalesced into a single, deafening voice. A voice that spoke in a language I didn't understand, yet somehow, I knew what it was saying. It was a greeting from something ancient and vast, something that had been waiting, patiently, for centuries, for response to its message etched into the earth. And now, it had received one. We were trapped, surrounded by the shifting, glowing lines, bathed in the unearthly luminescence of the reactivated geoglyphs. The humming reached its peak, and the ground beneath our feet bucked and swayed. The sky above, previously a black void, now shimmered with a strange, otherworldly light. Something was descending, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that whatever was coming, it wasn't friendly. It was coming for us, drawn by our unwitting response to its ancient call. And there was nowhere to hide. The desert, once silent and still, was now alive with the whispers of the gods. And we, the trespassers, were about to pay the price. What if the Nazca Lines were meant to communicate with the sky? Part 6 of 25. The silence after the tremor was thicker than the dust that coated everything. It pressed against our eardrums, a physical manifestation of the unspoken dread. Maria, still clutching the ancient shard, was ashen. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, stared at the now disturbed earth where the geoglyph of the hummingbird had been. A section of its wing, perhaps 20 feet long, had simply vanished. Not collapsed, not eroded, but gone asterisk, as if neatly excised by some colossal, invisible scalpel. It understood, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rasp of the desert wind. Understood what? I asked, my own voice tight with a fear I couldn't articulate. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned towards the vast expanse of the Nazca Desert, her gaze sweeping over the intricate network of lines and figures etched into the earth. The setting sun cast long, ominous shadows, transforming the familiar geoglyphs into grotesque, distorted shapes. The monkey seemed to leer, the spider to crawl, and the condor, once majestic, now appeared to be plummeting from the sky. We returned to the camp, the unspoken question hanging heavy in the air. Professor Ramirez, his face etched with a mixture of awe and apprehension, immediately began examining the shard Maria had recovered. He meticulously brushed away the clinging dust, revealing intricate carvings unlike anything we'd seen before. They weren't the familiar patterns of the Nazca culture, but something far older, far stranger. The carvings pulsed with a faint luminescence, almost imperceptible in the fading light, and seemed to shift and writhe under his gaze. That night, sleep evaded us. The silence of the desert was broken only by the whispers of the wind, each gust sounding like a sigh from some ancient, unknowable entity. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden menace, every rustle of fabric sounded like approaching footsteps. The tremor, the vanishing section of the hummingbird, the unsettling carvings on the shard, they all pointed to something terrifying, something beyond our comprehension. Just before dawn, a low hum vibrated through the ground, shaking our tents. We scrambled outside, blinking in the pre-dawn light, to witness a sight that would forever be etched into our memories. The sky, normally a canvas of deep indigo sprinkled with stars, was ablaze with a swirling vortex of colors. It pulsed and throbbed, radiating an unnatural light that bathed the desert in an eerie glow. The colors shifted and morphed, forming fleeting shapes that resembled the geoglyphs, the spider, the monkey, the hummingbird, only vastly larger, vastly more alive. They're answering, Maria breathed, her eyes fixed on the celestial display. They're answering the lines. Professor Ramirez, usually so composed, was trembling. He clutched the shard, its luminescence now pulsing in time with the lights in the sky. This isn't just communication, he stammered. It's a summoning. As the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in hues of orange and pink, the swirling vortex began to fade. The unnatural light diminished, and the familiar constellations slowly reappeared. The hum ceased, leaving behind a silence even more profound than before. But the sense of dread, the chilling certainty that something momentous had occurred, remained. We spent the rest of the day in a daze, packing our equipment and preparing to leave. The excitement of discovery had been replaced by a primal fear, a desperate need to escape the oppressive silence and the unsettling emptiness of the desert. The Nazca Lines, once objects of wonder, now seemed like warnings etched into the earth, a desperate plea to leave the sky undisturbed. As we drove away, I couldn't resist one last look back. The geoglyphs, now bathed in the warm glow of the morning sun, seemed deceptively benign. But I knew, deep down, that something had changed. The lines had spoken, and the sky had answered. And whatever lurked beyond the stars had heard our call. The shard, nestled securely in Professor Ramirez's bag, pulsed faintly. A silent reminder of the terrifying truth we had uncovered, that some doors are best left unopened, some questions best left unanswered. And some things, once awakened, cannot be put back to sleep. The journey back to Lima was a blur of anxiety and unspoken fear. We barely spoke, each of us lost in our own thoughts, replaying the events of the past few days, trying to make sense of the impossible. The sense of being watched, of being followed by something unseen, grew stronger with each passing mile. We were leaving the desert, but the desert wasn't leaving us. As we approached the city limits, a sudden jolt rocked the jeep. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. We were plunged into darkness. The only sound was the frantic beating of our hearts. Then, slowly, the sky above us began to glow. The same swirling vortex of colors, the same unnatural light, began to form, this time closer, more intense, more menacing. The Nazca Lines had spoken, and the sky had answered. And now, whatever lurked beyond the stars was coming for us. The dust devils whirled like dervishes across the desolate plains, their ochre skirts kicking up the ancient, sun-baked earth. Father Miguel clutched his crucifix, the silver cool against his clammy palm. He'd seen these dust devils before, but never so many, never so frantic. They danced around the perimeter of the spider, the largest of the Nazca Lines, its intricate legs stretching across the desert floor like the grasp of some colossal arachnid. The helicopter's rotors beat overhead, a frantic counterpoint to the whispering wind, mirroring the growing unease in his heart. "Are you seeing this, Father?" Javier's voice crackled through the headset. He was piloting the chopper, his face grim as he wrestled with the turbulent air. "The sensors are going haywire. Electromagnetic interference, but unlike anything I've ever encountered." Father Miguel swallowed, his throat dry. He'd convinced Javier, an old friend from his seminary days, to fly him over the lines. He needed to see them, to understand the growing dread that had sunk its claws into his soul. The translations of the recently discovered glyphs, found hidden beneath a crumbling temple near the hummingbird geoglyph, were chillingly clear. The lines weren't just messages. They were an invitation. "It's like something's listening," Javier continued, his voice strained. "Something, responding." The dust devils coalesced, merging into a single, towering vortex. It spun with increasing speed, drawing the loose sand and pebbles into its swirling embrace. The air crackled with static, and Father Miguel felt a tingling sensation on his skin, as if invisible fingers were tracing the lines of the crucifix he held. He looked down at the spider, its massive form etched into the earth. The swirling dust devil was positioned directly above it, its tip reaching towards the bruised, twilight sky. Suddenly, a low, resonant hum filled the air. It vibrated in Father Miguel's chest, resonating deep within his bones. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears, but rather felt within the core of his being. The hum intensified, and the dust devil stretched upwards, becoming a slender, undulating column that seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality. "Javier, we have to get out of here," Father Miguel shouted, but his words were swallowed by the oppressive hum. The helicopter shuddered violently. The controls locked up, and the aircraft began to spin, caught in the invisible grip of the towering vortex. Javier fought desperately, pulling at the unresponsive joystick, his face a mask of fear. Below them, the ground began to tremble. Cracks snaked across the desert floor, radiating outwards from the spider geoglyph. The earth buckled and heaved, as if something immense were struggling to break free. Father Miguel closed his eyes, gripping the crucifix tighter. He prayed, not for his own safety, but for the salvation of humanity. The glyphs had warned of this. They had spoken of a slumbering power, drawn to the invitation etched into the earth. A power beyond human comprehension. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, and the column of dust exploded outwards, revealing a sight that would forever be etched into Father Miguel's memory. A vast, swirling vortex of iridescent colors hung in the air, a gateway torn open in the sky. Within its depths, he could glimpse shifting shapes, impossible geometries, and colors that defied description. From the heart of the vortex, something descended. It wasn't a single entity, but a swarm, a writhing mass of something. They resembled insects, but on a scale that dwarfed the helicopter. Their bodies were chitinous and segmented, their wings vast and membranous, casting flickering shadows across the desert floor. They moved with unnerving grace, their movements fluid and hypnotic. The creatures spiraled downwards, circling the helicopter like vultures around a dying animal. Father Miguel could see their multifaceted eyes, shimmering with an alien intelligence. He felt a wave of pure, unadulterated dread wash over him, a terror so profound that it transcended fear. This wasn't just death, this was oblivion. One of the creatures, larger than the others, detached itself from the swarm. It approached the helicopter, its segmented mandibles clicking rhythmically. The hum intensified, and Father Miguel felt a sharp pain in his head, as if his mind were being probed, dissected. He saw flashes of images, swirling galaxies, collapsing stars, ancient landscapes that predated humanity. He saw the purpose of the Nazca Lines. They weren't just an invitation. They were a beacon, a guide, a map leading to a specific point in space-time. A point that opened a doorway to something else. The creature pressed its head against the helicopter's cockpit, its multifaceted eyes staring directly at Father Miguel. He could feel its gaze penetrating his very soul, stripping away his defenses, exposing his deepest fears and desires. Then, the glass shattered. The helicopter plunged towards the earth, the screaming of the engine drowned out by the deafening hum and the chittering of the creatures. As the ground rushed towards him, Father Miguel saw the other geoglyphs, the monkey, the hummingbird, the condor, all bathed in the eerie light of the swirling vortex. He realized, with a sickening certainty, that this was just the beginning. The Nazca Lines had fulfilled their purpose. The invitation had been accepted. And now, the earth belonged to something else. Part 8. The Whispers of the Sand. The unearthed glyph, its edges sharp despite the centuries buried, pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence. Not light exactly, but something adjacent. A shimmering that played tricks on the eyes, making it seem larger, smaller, then larger again. Hernandez, despite his scientific detachment, felt a chill crawl up his spine. It resonated with something primal, something deeply unsettling. Maria, ever the pragmatist, meticulously documented the find, photographing it from every angle, the clicks of her camera echoing strangely in the vast emptiness of the desert. Back at the makeshift camp, the wind picked up, whipping the canvas tents and carrying with it the fine, whispering sand. It infiltrated everything, their clothes, their food, their equipment. But it wasn't just the pervasive grit that unnerved them, it was the sound. The wind no longer howled, but whispered. Whispers that shifted and changed, too subtle to decipher, yet undeniably present. A cacophony of sibilant voices, just at the edge of hearing. It's the altitude, Hernandez muttered, rubbing his temples, trying to attribute the growing unease to a logical cause. The thin air, the isolation, it's playing tricks on us. But even he didn't believe his own words. The whispers seemed to penetrate his skull, wriggling into the deepest recesses of his mind. He found himself staring at the glyph, its unsettling shimmer now replicated in the night sky, the stars seeming to pulse and writhe in response. That night, sleep became a luxury. The whispers intensified, swirling around their tents, a chorus of unseen entities just beyond the veil of reality. Dreams, when they came, were fragmented and disturbing, visions of colossal shapes moving across the heavens, blotting out the stars, casting the earth into an eternal twilight. Maria, usually stoic and pragmatic, was visibly shaken. I hear them too, Pedro, she confessed, her voice barely a whisper above the incessant sibilance of the wind. They're talking about us. About the glyph. The following day, they ventured further into the desert, guided by the ancient map. The whispers followed them, a constant companion, a reminder of the unseen presence that watched their every move. The Nazca Lines, viewed from the ground, were nothing more than shallow trenches in the earth. But from the air, they transformed into colossal figures, intricate designs etched into the very fabric of the landscape. They were starting to understand the true scale of what they had stumbled upon. This wasn't just a message, it was a summoning. They discovered another glyph, smaller than the first, yet equally disturbing. This one depicted not an animal or a humanoid figure, but a series of concentric circles, radiating outwards like ripples in a pond. At its center was a single, stylized eye. The same unsettling shimmer emanated from it, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. As Hernandez knelt beside it, tracing its outline with his finger, the whispers intensified, coalescing into a single, chilling voice. It spoke not in words, but in a language of pure emotion, fear, anticipation, and something else, something far more ancient and incomprehensible. It resonated deep within him, bypassing his rational mind, speaking directly to his primal instincts. He recoiled, stumbling back, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at Maria, her face ashen, her eyes wide with terror. She had heard it too. The message was clear. They weren't just observing the Nazca Lines. They were participating in a ritual they didn't understand, a ritual with consequences they couldn't comprehend. That night, the whispers turned to screams. Not human screams, but something far more alien, more chilling. They tore through the night, echoing across the desolate landscape, a symphony of terror that clawed at their sanity. The stars in the sky pulsed and throbbed, mimicking the shimmering of the glyphs. The desert itself seemed to breathe, the sand shifting and swirling as if something colossal was stirring beneath the surface. They huddled together in their tent, the thin canvas offering little comfort against the encroaching darkness. The screams intensified, growing louder, closer, as if whatever was out there was descending upon them. Hernandez knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were not alone. Something was coming, something had been summoned, and it was hungry. The ground began to tremble. Part 9. The Whispers of the Sand. The unearthed glyphs, stark against the disturbed earth, seemed to pulse with a low hum, a vibration that resonated not through the air, but directly into our bones. Dr. Ramirez, his face pale and drawn, traced the intricate lines with a trembling finger. He muttered something in Quechua, a prayer or a curse, I couldn't tell. The wind, which had been mercifully absent, picked up, whipping around us, carrying whispers of sand that stung our skin. The glyphs, unlike the Nazca Lines we were familiar with, were intricate and detailed, depicting not just animals and geometric shapes, but beings. Beings with elongated limbs, bulbous heads, and large, dark eyes that seemed to follow us. Some held what looked like strange instruments, others were intertwined in grotesque embraces, their forms blurring into a disturbing, organic mess. They're communicating, Ramirez whispered, his voice hoarse. They're telling a story. A story? Maria asked, her voice tight with fear. What kind of story? Ramirez shook his head, his eyes wide with a strange mix of terror and awe. A story of creation, of arrival. The wind intensified, howling around us like a banshee. The sand stung our eyes, making it difficult to see. The whispers grew louder, no longer just the rustle of sand, but guttural murmurs, a chorus of voices speaking in a language we couldn't understand, yet felt deep within our primal core. It was a language of the earth, of the ancient, of the things that should have remained buried. A wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled back, my hand instinctively reaching for the comforting coolness of my canteen. But even the water felt tainted, thick and metallic on my tongue. We need to leave, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This place, it's not right. Ramirez seemed not to hear me. He was kneeling by the glyphs, his fingers tracing the outline of one of the beings, a creature with a serpentine body and a head that resembled a cluster of stars. He began to chant, his voice rising above the wind, a strange, melodic drone that seemed to harmonize with the whispers of the sand. Maria grabbed my arm, her grip tight. He's losing it, David. We have to get him out of here. I nodded, fear gripping my heart. We tried to pull Ramirez away, but he resisted, his body rigid, his eyes fixed on the glyphs. The wind howled louder, the whispers intensified, and the ground beneath our feet began to tremble. Suddenly, a section of the earth near the edge of the excavation collapsed, revealing a dark, gaping hole. The air around it shimmered with an unnatural heat, and a stench of decay, of something ancient and foul, rose from its depths. Ramirez stopped chanting and turned to us, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling light. He pointed to the hole, a smile spreading across his face, a smile that didn't belong to the man we knew. "They're waiting," he whispered, his voice no longer his own, but a hollow echo of the whispers in the wind. "They've been waiting for a long time." Terror lent me a strength I didn't know I possessed. I grabbed Maria and pulled her away from the edge of the pit. We stumbled back, away from Ramirez, away from the glyphs, away from the gaping maw in the earth. The wind screamed around us, the sand biting at our exposed skin. The whispers rose to a crescendo, a cacophony of voices that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. And then, from the depths of the hole, a light began to emanate, a pulsating, otherworldly glow that cast long, distorted shadows across the desert floor. We ran blindly through the swirling sand, our lungs burning, our hearts pounding in our chests. We didn't look back. We didn't dare to look back. The whispers pursued us, echoing in our ears, promising a revelation we were too terrified to witness. As we stumbled over the crest of a dune, I risked a glance back. The light from the hole illuminated the Nazca Plateau, casting the familiar lines in a grotesque, new light. They seemed to writhe and shift, no longer static etchings on the earth, but living, breathing things. And in the center of it all, silhouetted against the unnatural glow, stood Ramirez, his arms outstretched, welcoming the dawn of something terrible. The whispers in the wind became a single, unified voice, a voice that spoke not in words, but in a feeling, a deep, visceral understanding that chilled me to the bone. They were coming, and Ramirez had shown them the way. Part 10. The Offering. The silence after the tremor was thicker than the dust that coated everything. It clung to the air, muffling the usual desert wind. Even the rasping breaths of the remaining team members seemed strangely subdued. We huddled together, flashlights casting jittery beams across the newly disturbed earth. The Nazca Lines, once majestic figures etched into the landscape, now seemed like crude scratches on the back of a slumbering beast. "It felt intentional," whispered Elena, her voice trembling. Like the earth itself was responding. I swallowed, the dryness in my throat making it difficult. I didn't want to believe her, but the perfectly timed tremor, coinciding with our attempts to decipher the newly discovered glyphs, was too much of a coincidence. We had awakened something. We radioed back to base camp, our voices strained and tight. Professor Armitage, usually boisterous and brimming with academic enthusiasm, responded with a chilling calmness. He instructed us to return immediately, bringing any artifacts we had recovered. His tone implied more than his words. Fear, a cold and creeping dread, radiated through the static crackle. The journey back was tense. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every gust of wind carried whispers that prickled the back of my neck. The desert, once a vast expanse of barren beauty, had become a malevolent entity, watching us, waiting. Back at base camp, the atmosphere was thick with a palpable anxiety. The Peruvian workers, usually jovial and chatty, were huddled together, murmuring prayers in hushed tones. Professor Armitage, his face pale and drawn, met us at the entrance to the main tent. "They know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His eyes, usually sparkling with intellectual curiosity, were now dull, filled with a haunting resignation. "They know we've been trying to communicate." He led us inside, where the artifacts we'd recovered lay on a table, bathed in the harsh light of a kerosene lamp. Among them was the obsidian shard, its surface now reflecting the flickering flame with an unnerving intensity. The glyphs, once barely visible, now seemed to glow faintly, pulsating with a strange, internal light. The tremor, it wasn't natural, Professor Armitage continued, his gaze fixed on the shard. It was a warning. He explained that after we'd radioed in, the ground beneath the camp had begun to tremble. Small at first, the tremors had grown in intensity, culminating in a violent shake that had toppled equipment and sent cracked spider webbing through the canvas tents. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. "The workers, they say it's the Apis," he said, his voice laced with a mixture of fear and fascination. "Mountain spirits. Guardians of the land." One of the Peruvian workers, an older man named Miguel, stepped forward. His face, etched with deep lines of worry, spoke volumes. "The earth is angry," he said, his voice raspy. "We have disturbed the ancient ones. We must appease them." His words hung in the air, heavy with foreboding. Appease them? How do you appease something you don't understand, something that communicates through earthquakes and cryptic glyphs? The rest of the night passed in a blur of fear and whispered conversations. The tremors, though smaller, continued intermittently, each one a sharp reminder of the unseen force we had awakened. By dawn, a consensus had been reached. We needed to make an offering. Miguel explained the ritual. It was an ancient practice, passed down through generations, a way to appease the mountain spirits and restore balance to the land. It required a sacrifice. Not a human sacrifice, thankfully, but something of value, something precious. We gathered at the foot of one of the larger geoglyphs, the figure of a hummingbird etched into the desert floor. The rising sun cast long, distorted shadows across the landscape, giving the ancient lines an almost sinister appearance. A pit had been dug, lined with stones, ready to receive the offering. Professor Armitage stepped forward, his face etched with a strange mixture of resignation and determination. He held the obsidian shard in his trembling hand. It pulsed with a faint, ethereal glow, almost as if it was aware of its impending fate. He placed the shard in the pit, the black stone contrasting sharply with the light brown earth. Miguel then added a handful of coca leaves, whispering ancient words in Quechua. The rest of us, a motley crew of scientists and researchers, stood in silence, watching the ritual unfold with a mixture of apprehension and morbid fascination. As the last of the earth was piled over the obsidian shard, burying it deep within the ground, a chilling gust of wind swept across the desert. The air grew cold, and a low, guttural hum resonated from deep within the earth. It felt like the desert itself was drawing a breath. We had made our offering. But had it been enough? Or had we simply appeased a slumbering giant for a moment, delaying the inevitable? The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. It was the silence of something ancient, something vast, something waiting. Part 11. Whispers of Clay. The dust swirled around Maria's ankles, a rust-colored halo clinging to her worn boots. She traced the outline of the hummingbird with her eyes, its gigantic form stretching across the arid plateau. The Nazca Lines, once a source of wonder, now felt like claw marks etched into the earth, a desperate plea for attention from something, uncaring. The humming in her ears, a constant companion since the first tremor, had intensified, a low thrumming vibration that resonated deep within her bones. Padre Marco was gone, vanished. His tent lay crumpled, the remnants of his last meal scattered like fallen leaves. Only his journal remained, its pages filled with increasingly frantic scribbles about the stars, the lines, and a terrible symphony approaching from the void. Maria shuddered, the cold desert air doing little to quell the rising tide of fear within her. She hadn't told the others about the journal. Not yet. The remaining researchers, already frayed at the edges by the escalating strangeness, were clinging to the last vestiges of scientific explanation. Seismic activity, unusual atmospheric phenomena, mass hysteria, anything but the creeping dread that whispered from the lines themselves. Maria knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the core, that the earth was speaking, and no one was listening. The humming grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural moan. The ground beneath her feet vibrated with increasing intensity. Maria looked up at the sky, a vast expanse of unbroken blue that seemed to press down on her, suffocating her. She imagined the lines, not as static figures etched into the earth, but as a giant, pulsating circuit, a receiver tuned to a frequency beyond human comprehension. Driven by a primal instinct, Maria returned to the excavation site. The unearthed artifact, a smooth, obsidian sphere pulsating with a faint inner light, sat undisturbed in its cradle of sand. It seemed to radiate a warmth that belied the desert chill, a warmth that drew her closer, like a moth to a flickering flame. As she reached for the sphere, a voice, thin and reedy, whispered in her ear. It wasn't a spoken language, but a series of clicks and whistles that seemed to bypass her ears and resonate directly within her skull. She recoiled, stumbling back, the whispers echoing in the sudden silence. The humming had ceased. The ground was still. The silence was more terrifying than the noise. It was a pregnant silence, a held breath before the scream. Then, the ground began to shift. Not the violent tremors of the past few days, but a slow, deliberate undulation. The Nazca Lines, viewed from above, were moving. The monkey stretched its limbs, the spider unfurled its legs, the hummingbird beat its wings. The earth itself was rearranging itself, the lines shifting and reforming into new, unsettling patterns. Maria scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. She had to warn the others. She had to make them understand. As she ran towards the camp, she saw them. Standing near the central tent, their faces pale and their eyes fixed on the sky, were the remaining researchers. They weren't looking at the lines, but at something beyond them, something hidden in the vast, blue expanse. Maria followed their gaze, her breath catching in her throat. The sky, once empty, now held a single, luminous point. It wasn't a star, not a planet, but something else entirely. It pulsed with a sickly, yellowish light, growing larger with every passing second. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the air with their alien cadence. They spoke of ancient pacts, of promises made and broken, of a debt that was long overdue. Maria understood then, with a chilling clarity, that the Nazca Lines weren't a message to the sky, but a summoning. A beacon. The luminous point descended, its light casting long, distorted shadows across the desert floor. The researchers, mesmerized, began to walk towards it, their arms outstretched, their faces etched with a mixture of awe and terror. Maria wanted to scream, to warn them, but the words caught in her throat, strangled by the oppressive weight of the impending doom. As the light drew closer, she could make out its shape. It wasn't a single object, but a swarm of smaller entities, swirling and coalescing like a cloud of locusts. They were vaguely humanoid, their limbs thin and elongated, their heads disproportionately large. Their skin shimmered with an oily, iridescent sheen. Maria watched in horror as the researchers reached the light, their bodies swallowed by the swirling mass. There were no screams, no cries for help, just a sickening silence as they were absorbed, assimilated, erased. The humming returned, deeper and more resonant than before. The earth throbbed beneath her feet, a heartbeat counting down the final seconds. Maria knew, with a certainty that transcended fear, that she was next. The earth had spoken, and the sky had answered. And the answer was not for human ears. Part 12. The Whispering Sand. The silence after the tremor was more unsettling than the shaking itself. The air hung heavy, thick with an unseen dust that coated our tongues and gritted between our teeth. Amelia coughed, a rasping sound that echoed strangely in the stillness. The humming in the geoglyphs had ceased, leaving a void in our ears, a phantom vibration that made the world feel unreal. Did it work? Elena whispered, her voice trembling. Her eyes were fixed on the hummingbird figure etched into the desert floor, now partially obscured by fallen rocks and dust. I shook my head, unable to speak. The ground beneath our feet felt unstable, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The Andean condor, the largest of the Nazca Lines we'd investigated, loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. It felt like it was watching us, waiting. We returned to the camp, the silence clinging to us like a shroud. Maria was waiting, her face etched with worry. She hadn't felt the tremor, sheltered as she was in the deeper part of the canyon, but the unnatural quiet had alarmed her. When we told her what happened, she crossed herself and muttered a prayer in Quechua. That night, sleep was impossible. Every rustle of the wind, every shifting of the sand, sounded like the approach of something vast and unknowable. I kept seeing the distorted face in the swirling dust, the hollow eyes burning into me. The whispers started again, but this time they were closer, more insistent, weaving their way into my dreams. They spoke of a hunger, a vast cosmic appetite that spanned millennia. They spoke of the Nazca Lines as more than just drawings, but as a summoning ritual, a beacon meant to attract the attention of something beyond human comprehension. They spoke of a time before the Inca, before even the Nazca people themselves, when the desert was a gateway to the stars. I awoke in a cold sweat, the whispers still echoing in my mind. The sky was beginning to lighten, painting the eastern horizon with streaks of gray and rose. The others were still asleep, their faces pale and drawn in the dim light. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I climbed out of the tent and walked to the edge of the canyon, the whispering sand crunching beneath my boots. The air was crisp and cold, and the desert stretched before me, vast and empty. Or so it seemed. As the first rays of the sun crested the horizon, I noticed something strange. A subtle shimmering in the air above the Nazca Lines, a distortion like heat rising from the desert floor. But it wasn't heat. It was something else, something unnatural. I squinted, trying to make sense of it. The shimmering intensified, coalescing into a swirling vortex of light and shadow. It hung in the air above the spider figure, pulsating slowly, like a breathing organism. My heart pounded in my chest. I stumbled back, a primal fear gripping me. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. This was something else. The vortex expanded, growing larger and more defined. Within its swirling depths, I could see glimpses of something truly alien. Shapes and colors that defied description, geometries that warped and twisted the very fabric of reality. It was a window into a realm beyond human comprehension, a glimpse into the cosmic abyss. And then, I heard it. Not the whispers in the sand, but a sound that resonated deep within my bones. A sound that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my soul. It was a low, guttural hum, laced with an undercurrent of something ancient and malevolent. The ground began to tremble again, this time with a ferocity that dwarfed the previous tremors. Cracks appeared in the earth, spider webbing across the desert floor. The air crackled with an unseen energy, and the vortex above the spider figure pulsed with blinding light. I turned and ran, screaming for the others to wake up. But I knew, deep down, that it was too late. Whatever we had awakened, whatever we had summoned from the depths of the cosmos, was here. And it was hungry. The whispers in the sand had become a roar. The Nazca Lines were not meant to be seen. They were meant to be heard. And we had just made the biggest mistake of our lives. The humming intensified, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the very bones of the desert. The ground beneath our feet trembled, a slow, rhythmic pulse like the heartbeat of some gargantuan beast. The air grew thick, heavy, and charged with an unseen energy. Elena, pale and trembling, clutched my arm, her eyes wide with terror. "It's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing hum. I gripped her hand, trying to offer a reassurance I didn't feel. The glyph we'd unearthed, the one depicting a grotesque, multi-limbed being reaching towards a swirling vortex, seemed to pulsate with an internal light. The red ochre pigment shimmered, as if the ancient blood used to paint it had come back to life. The humming was now a deafening drone, and the ground shook violently, sending plumes of dust spiraling into the already hazy air. Above us, the sky began to distort. The familiar constellations warped and twisted into unrecognizable patterns. A section of the heavens, directly above the newly excavated glyph, began to shimmer and swirl. It was like looking through rippling water, the stars beyond fractured and fragmented. The air crackled with static, and the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. "Look," Elena gasped, pointing towards the swirling vortex in the sky. A shape was coalescing within the celestial maelstrom, a dark, amorphous blob that gradually began to take on a more defined form. It was impossibly vast, dwarfing even the largest constellations. Tendrils of inky blackness snaked out from its central mass, probing the fabric of reality. As it descended, the humming reached a fever pitch, and the ground beneath us bucked and heaved like a ship caught in a storm. Fear, raw and primal, gripped me. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but witness the unfolding horror above, but I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a morbid fascination. The air grew cold, a biting chill that cut through the desert heat. The stench of ozone filled our nostrils, and the metallic tang of blood coated my tongue. The shape in the sky continued its descent, its form becoming clearer with every passing moment. It was the being depicted in the glyph, the multi-limbed monstrosity, but magnified 1,000-fold. Its limbs, too numerous to count, writhed and twisted like the tentacles of a colossal squid. Its body was a swirling vortex of darkness, punctuated by flashes of blinding light. And at its center, a single, massive eye opened, its gaze cold and indifferent, fixing upon us with terrifying intensity. The humming ceased abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence that was even more unnerving. The ground stilled, but the air continued to crackle with static, charged with an almost palpable dread. The being hung suspended in the air, its shadow engulfing the Nazca Desert, its presence a suffocating weight upon our souls. Then, it spoke, not with sound, but with a direct intrusion into our minds, a voice that resonated within the very core of our being. It was a language of pure thought, ancient and alien, yet somehow understood. "We have heard your call," the voice echoed within our minds. "The gate is open, asterisk." Elena screamed, a high-pitched, keening wail of pure terror. I could only stand there, frozen in place, as the being extended one of its countless limbs towards the ground. The limb, vast and dark, descended slowly, like the hand of God reaching down to smite the unworthy. It touched the earth, and the ground beneath it rippled and buckled. A fissure, deep and dark, opened up in the desert floor, splitting the earth like a rotten fruit. From within the fissure, a sickly green light pulsed, illuminating the swirling mists that rose from its depths. "The way is prepared," the voice boomed within our minds. "Join us, asterisk." The ground around the fissure began to collapse, the earth crumbling away to reveal the gaping maw of the abyss below. Elena, still screaming, stumbled backwards, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. I reached out to grab her, but it was too late. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and she plunged into the darkness, her screams echoing off the walls of the chasm before being swallowed by the silence. I stood at the edge of the abyss, gazing into the swirling green depths, the voice of the being still echoing in my mind. "Join us." The ground beneath my feet trembled, threatening to give way at any moment. The abyss beckoned, promising oblivion, an escape from the horror above. A part of me, a small, desperate part, wanted to jump, to embrace the darkness and end the torment. But another part of me, the part that clung to the fading embers of hope, refused. I turned away from the abyss, away from the monstrous being in the sky, and began to run. I ran through the desert, the ground shaking beneath my feet, the screams of Elena echoing in my ears. I ran towards the rising sun, towards the faint hope of escape, towards the uncertain future that lay ahead. I ran, knowing that the being in the sky was watching, waiting, and that the Nazca Lines, once a mystery, were now a chilling testament to the horrors that lurked beyond the stars. Part 14. The Whispering Dust. The dust, that insidious, omnipresent dust, seemed to whisper now. Not in any discernible language, but in a low, sibilant hiss that burrowed into the deepest recesses of the mind. It clung to everything, our clothes, our skin, our hair, a constant, gritty reminder of the desolate landscape and the growing horror it concealed. Sleep, already a fragile commodity, became almost impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the whispering intensified, morphing into distorted voices chanting in a rhythmic, unsettling drone. The dig site, once a beacon of scientific discovery, had transformed into a macabre theater. The Nazca Lines, formerly objects of fascination, were now etched into our minds like scars. We'd mapped them, photographed them, measured them, but their true purpose remained elusive, a chilling enigma that hung over us like a shroud. The more we learned, the less we understood. Maria, once so vibrant and enthusiastic, was now a shadow of her former self. Her laughter had been replaced by a nervous tick in her left eye, and her once bright eyes held a haunted, distant look. She spoke less and less, preferring to pore over the latest satellite imagery, searching for what? I wasn't sure anymore. I knew, deep down, that whatever she was searching for, she wouldn't like what she found. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple, Maria beckoned me over to her makeshift workstation. Her face, illuminated by the flickering lamplight, was pale and drawn. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a newly enhanced image of a section of the desert several miles south of our current location. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The image depicted a previously undiscovered geoglyph, hidden beneath a layer of wind-blown sand. It was unlike anything we had seen before. Not a spider, or a hummingbird, or a monkey. This was something else. It resembled a vast, swirling vortex, its lines spiraling inwards towards a central point. Emanating from the center were a series of smaller, intricate patterns that looked eerily like eyes. Dozens of them, staring blankly upwards. What is it?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. Maria shook her head slowly. "I don't know. But I have a terrible feeling we're about to find out." The next morning, we set out to locate the new geoglyph. The journey was arduous. The unrelenting sun beat down on us mercilessly, the air thick with the whispering dust. The landscape, stretching endlessly before us, seemed to shift and distort in the shimmering heat, playing tricks on our eyes. We finally reached the site just as the sun began to set. Standing at the edge of the vortex, I felt a palpable shift in the air, a strange, electric hum that resonated deep within my bones. The whispering of the dust intensified, becoming almost deafening. This is wrong," Carlos muttered, his voice trembling. His usual jovial demeanor had been replaced by a palpable fear. As we descended into the vortex, the air grew colder, the whispering more insistent. The ground beneath our feet felt strangely hollow, as if we were walking on thin ice. The eye-like patterns, now closer, seemed to follow our every move, their blank stares burning into our souls. At the center of the vortex, we found a large, circular depression in the ground. It was filled with the same fine, whispering dust that covered the entire desert. But here, it was different. It swirled and pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light, like a miniature galaxy trapped within the earth. Suddenly, Maria screamed. I spun around to see her pointing towards the sky, her face contorted in terror. Following her gaze, I saw it. A vast, dark shape descending from the heavens. It was amorphous, constantly shifting and changing, blotting out the stars like a celestial inkblot. The whispering of the dust reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that filled the air. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble violently. The eyes in the geoglyph glowed with an eerie, internal light, fixated on the descending shape. Terror gripped me, cold and paralyzing. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there and watch the inevitable unfold. But I was frozen, rooted to the spot, as the darkness descended upon us, swallowing the desert, the Nazca Lines, and everything we knew. The whispering dust, now a howling wind, whipped around us, carrying with it a single, chilling word, repeated over and over again. Awake. Part 15. Whispers in the dust. The rhythmic chanting grew louder, reverberating through the cracked earth and into our very bones. It was a language ancient and guttural, each syllable a physical blow against the silence of the desert. The Nazca Lines, bathed in the unnatural moonlight, seemed to pulse with an inner light, their etched forms shifting and writhing like colossal worms. The archaeologists, once so eager to document and decipher, were now huddled together, eyes wide with a terror that transcended scientific curiosity. Professor Armitage, his face a mask of stark fear, gripped his crucifix as if it were a lifeline. Even Javier, hardened by years of excavating ancient tombs, trembled, his usual bravado replaced by a chilling vulnerability. I looked to Elena, seeking some semblance of strength, some shared understanding in the face of the encroaching dread. Her face, etched with the same terror as the others, was streaked with tears. She clutched the fragmented pottery shard, its cryptic symbols now seeming to glow faintly in the moonlight. "They're answering," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rising chant. "They're answering the call." The ground began to tremble, a low, ominous rumble that grew steadily in intensity. Fissures, deep and jagged, snaked across the desert floor, radiating outwards from the largest of the geoglyphs, the hummingbird. From these fissures, a sickly yellow light seeped, illuminating the rising dust devils that danced like phantoms across the plain. The chanting intensified, rising to a fever pitch. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a palpable sense of something vast and ancient awakening. I felt a pressure in my ears, a dizzying sensation of being pulled downwards, as if the very ground beneath our feet was giving way. Then, from the heart of the hummingbird, a colossal shape began to emerge. It was slow, agonizingly slow, like a titan rising from a millennia-long slumber. The earth groaned and buckled under its immense weight. The sickly yellow light intensified, blinding us momentarily. When my vision cleared, I saw it. A being of unimaginable size and grotesque form, its body a tapestry of shifting shadows and flickering lights. It was vaguely humanoid, but distorted, elongated, as if stretched and warped by some unimaginable force. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, ending in clawed hands that scraped against the earth. Its head, a grotesque parody of a human skull, was elongated and pointed, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. The chanting stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl that emanated from the creature's gaping maw. It was a sound that resonated deep within our primal fears, a sound that spoke of an age long before humanity walked the earth. Terror gripped me, paralyzing me in place. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't. I could only stand there, transfixed by the horror unfolding before me. The creature shifted its gaze, its glowing eyes sweeping across the desert. It seemed to focus on us, on the small group of humans huddled together at the edge of the Nazca Lines. A wave of pure, unadulterated malice washed over us, a palpable force that threatened to crush our very souls. Elena screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound that was quickly swallowed by the vast emptiness of the desert. The creature took a step towards us, its immense form casting a long, distorted shadow over the plain. The ground trembled with each ponderous step. Professor Armitage, his face ashen, began to mutter a prayer, his voice barely audible above the creature's guttural growls. Javier, his eyes wide with terror, fumbled for his pistol, but his hands shook so violently that he dropped it. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that we were doomed. We had stumbled upon something ancient and terrible, something that should have remained undisturbed. We had answered the call of the Nazca Lines, and now we were about to pay the price. The creature was almost upon us. I could feel its hot, fetid breath on my face. Its shadow enveloped us, plunging us into darkness. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. Then, a new sound cut through the air. It was a high-pitched, whistling sound, almost like a bird's call. The creature stopped, its head tilting slightly as if listening. The whistling sound grew louder, closer. The creature turned its gaze towards the source of the sound. In the distance, a small, flickering light appeared, moving rapidly towards us. It was too small to be a plane, too fast to be a car. It zipped across the desert floor, leaving a trail of shimmering light in its wake. The creature let out a deafening roar, a sound filled with rage and frustration. It took a step towards the approaching light, its massive form shaking the earth. But the light was too fast. It zipped past the creature, circling it once, twice, then shot up into the sky, disappearing into the vastness of the night. The creature stood there for a moment, its head tilted back, its glowing eyes fixed on the point where the light had disappeared. Then, with a final, frustrated roar, it turned and lumbered back towards the hummingbird, slowly sinking back into the earth from which it had emerged. The chanting began again, low and mournful, as the earth closed over the creature, sealing it once more within its ancient prison. The sickly yellow light faded, leaving the desert bathed in the cold, indifferent light of the moon. We were left standing there, trembling and silent, in the shadow of the Nazca Lines. We had been spared, but by what, and for how long? The whispering in the dust had been answered, and the sky had borne witness. But the true horror, I knew, was yet to come. Part 16. Whispers in the dust. The silence after the scream was deafening. It stretched, thin and brittle, across the desert, amplifying the hammering of my own heart. Maria clutched my arm, her fingernails digging into my skin, her eyes wide with terror. We both stared at the spot where Eduardo had stood, now empty save for a lingering wisp of dust devils spiraling upwards like grasping fingers. Where did he go? Maria whispered, her voice choked. I shook my head, my throat too tight to speak. The earth felt different, vibrating with an unnatural hum. The previously welcoming Nazca Lines now seemed like ominous glyphs etched into the very skin of a monstrous being. The giant hummingbird, the monkey, the spider, all seemed to be staring back at us, their outlines pulsing with an internal light. We need to leave, I finally managed, my voice a croak. Now, we scrambled back towards the jeep, the desert floor seeming to stretch endlessly before us. Every rustle of the wind, every shifting shadow, sent a fresh wave of fear through me. The humming intensified, vibrating through the soles of my boots and into my bones. As we reached the jeep, a chilling whisper slithered through the air, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, but its meaning was clear. Fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely insert them into the ignition. The whisper grew louder, the unseen voice weaving itself into the fabric of the desert. It spoke of ancient pacts, of sacrifices made, and of a hunger that could never be satiated. The jeep finally roared to life, and I slammed my foot on the accelerator, desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere. We sped away from the lines, leaving the whispering desert behind us, but the feeling of dread remained, clinging to us like the dust that coated our clothes. Back in the small town, the vibrant colors and the sounds of everyday life seemed surreal after the stark emptiness of the desert. We checked into a dusty motel, the peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights adding to the unsettling feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. Maria remained silent, huddled in the corner of the room, her eyes fixed on the blank television screen. The horror of what we had witnessed, the inexplicable disappearance of Eduardo, had left her shaken to the core. I tried to speak to her, to offer some comfort, but words seemed inadequate in the face of such profound unease. Night fell, bringing with it a new wave of fear. The whispers, though fainter, still echoed in my mind. I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old motel, every sound amplified by my paranoia. The Nazca Lines haunted my thoughts, their intricate patterns twisting and shifting in my mind's eye. I felt a growing certainty that they were not merely drawings on the ground, but something far more sinister, a gateway, perhaps, or a summoning circle. Just before dawn, a faint tapping at the window startled me. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping came again, insistent, rhythmic. I cautiously approached the window, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. Standing there, silhouetted against the faint light, was a figure. Tall and gaunt, its features obscured by the darkness. It raised a hand, and I saw that it held a small, smooth stone. It was the same type of stone we had found near the lines, the one with the strange, swirling patterns. Terror gripped me. I stumbled back from the window, my breath catching in my throat. The tapping stopped. I waited, frozen in fear, for the figure to break the window, to force its way into the room. But it didn't. Slowly, cautiously, I approached the window again. The figure was gone, but on the windowsill, nestled against the glass, lay the stone. I didn't dare touch it. Its presence radiated an aura of menace, a silent promise of further horrors to come. The sun began to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, but the light brought no comfort. The whispers returned, stronger now, more insistent. They spoke of a debt that needed to be paid, of a sacrifice that had been incomplete. And they whispered a name, my name. I knew then that we were not safe. The desert had claimed Eduardo, and it was coming for us next. The Nazca Lines, once a source of wonder and fascination, were now a terrifying reminder of the unseen forces we had awakened. And the small, smooth stone on the windowsill was a chilling harbinger of the darkness that was closing in. Part 17. Whispers of Dust. The silence that followed the echoing boom was more terrifying than any scream. The Nazca Desert, normally alive with the whisper of wind across sand, held its breath. Even the usual nocturnal rustlings of unseen desert creatures were absent, as if they too understood the unnatural gravity of the moment. The fissure continued to glow, a malevolent gash in the earth, pulsating with an inner light that seemed to shift and writhe. We huddled around the jeep, the headlights casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the shimmering emanations from the chasm. Amelia clutched the ancient Nazca pot, her knuckles bone white. Professor Armitage, normally a bastion of stoic rationality, trembled visibly. He kept muttering about celestial alignments and gravitational anomalies, his words disjointed and laced with a fear I'd never seen in him before. It's responding, he finally managed, pointing a shaky finger toward the sky. I followed his gaze. At first, I saw nothing. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the stars began to shimmer. Not the usual twinkling caused by atmospheric disturbance, but a rhythmic pulsation, as if some unseen hand were dimming and brightening their light. The pulsation grew stronger, faster, mirroring the pulsing light emanating from the fissure. "They're communicating," Amelia whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding of my heart. A low hum began to permeate the air, a sound that vibrated deep within my chest, a resonance that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to my bones. The hum grew louder, morphing into a guttural drone that filled the desert, drowning out all other sounds. The ground began to tremble again, this time a constant, rhythmic vibration that made my teeth chatter. I looked back at the fissure. The glow had intensified, becoming almost blinding. A thick, black smoke began to pour from the crack, swirling and twisting into grotesque shapes above the desert floor. The shapes shifted and reformed, becoming more defined, more purposeful. They looked like hands. Giant, skeletal hands, formed from the swirling smoke, reaching towards the sky. They moved with an unnatural grace, their long, bony fingers twitching as if grasping at the pulsating stars. The sight was so utterly alien, so profoundly disturbing, that a primal terror gripped me, a fear so deep it bordered on paralysis. Professor Armitage, his face ashen, began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, his voice a strange mix of terror and awe. Amelia, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination, tightened her grip on the Nazca pot. The pot, I noticed with growing horror, was beginning to glow faintly, its intricate markings pulsating in time with the rhythmic throbbing of the fissure. The skeletal hands continued to reach, their movements becoming more frantic, more desperate. The stars above pulsed faster, brighter, as if answering the silent call of the earth. The hum intensified, becoming a deafening roar that seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. Suddenly, one of the hands stopped its upward reach. It turned, slowly, deliberately, and pointed directly at us. The air crackled with an unseen energy. The ground beneath our feet bucked and heaved. The jeep rocked violently, threatening to topple over. I felt a searing heat on my skin, as if the very air was burning. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. The roar ceased. The ground stilled. The skeletal hands dissipated into wisps of black smoke that were quickly swallowed by the desert wind. The pulsing light from the fissure dimmed, leaving only a faint, ethereal glow. The stars, still shimmering slightly, resumed their normal twinkling. The silence that followed was even more profound than before. It was the silence of anticipation, of something waiting, something watching. We remained huddled around the jeep, too stunned to speak, too terrified to move. The Nazca Desert, once again shrouded in darkness, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Professor Armitage finally broke the silence, his voice a hoarse whisper. They acknowledged us." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. I understood what he meant. The beings, whatever they were, had seen us. They had heard us. And they had responded. But the question remained, and it chilled me to the bone. What was their response? What did it mean? And what would they do next? The Nazca Lines, once a mystery, were now a terrifying testament to something beyond our comprehension. We had sought to understand their message, to communicate with the sky. And now, the sky had answered. And the whispers of the dust carried a chilling premonition of what was to come. Part 18. The Whispers of the Dust. The wind howled a mournful dirge across the desolate plains, whipping dust devils into frenzied dances around us. The Nazca Lines, usually stark and imposing, were now obscured by the swirling brown haze, appearing and disappearing like phantoms. The silence of the radio was deafening. No response from Lima, no crackle of static, just the oppressive weight of isolation. Maria clutched the ancient pottery shard tighter, her knuckles white. The glyphs etched into its surface seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light, mirroring the throbbing unease in my own chest. The shard, discovered in the unearthed chamber beneath the spider figure, felt like a cursed talisman, radiating an unsettling energy. We had hoped it held the key to understanding the lines, but now I wondered if it was a lock we shouldn't have opened. "Something's different," Maria whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. I nodded, scanning the obscured landscape. The dust, thick and clinging, seemed to amplify the silence, swallowing sound. It was more than just the weather. A palpable shift had occurred, a deepening of the unease that had settled over us since entering the chamber. The air felt heavy, charged, as if the very ground beneath our feet was holding its breath. Then we heard it, a faint, high-pitched whistling, barely discernible at first, carried on the wind. It rose and fell, a chilling melody that seemed to emanate from the heart of the desert itself. We exchanged wide-eyed glances, fear tightening its grip around us. "What is that?" Maria asked, her voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to answer. The whistling intensified, weaving itself into the howl of the wind, creating a discordant symphony of dread. It felt like the desert was waking up, stretching limbs that had lain dormant for centuries. The dust devils began to move differently, no longer random swirls, but purposeful, spiraling towards the largest of the Nazca figures, the hummingbird. As they converged, the dust began to coalesce, forming a towering vortex that reached towards the sky like a beckoning finger. The whistling intensified, morphing into a series of clicks and pops, sounds that resonated deep within our bones. Maria cried out, dropping the pottery shard. It landed on the hard ground with a dull thud, miraculously unbroken. The glyphs seemed to glow brighter, pulsating in time with the unearthly sounds. A shape began to form within the dust vortex, a dark, amorphous silhouette against the swirling brown haze. It pulsed and shifted, growing larger with each passing moment. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through me, paralyzing me in place. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was rooted to the spot, my gaze fixed on the growing horror in the sky. The whistling stopped. The clicks and pops ceased. An oppressive silence descended, broken only by the rasp of our own breaths. The dust vortex stabilized, revealing the shape within. It was immense. A vast, dark shape that blotted out the stars. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, defying description, a nightmare-given form. Its edges shimmered and distorted, as if it existed on a different plane of reality, intruding into our own. I felt a primal terror, a deep-seated instinct telling me to flee, to hide, to do anything but witness this monstrosity. Then, a voice. Not a sound carried on the wind, but a voice that echoed within my mind, cold and ancient, resonating with the weight of eons. It spoke in a language I didn't understand, yet somehow, I comprehended its meaning. "We have heard your call, **. The voice was not directed at us, I realized with a chilling certainty. It was directed at something else, something beyond the veil of reality. The Nazca Lines, the chamber, the shard, they were not meant to communicate with the sky. They were meant to open a door to the sky. And we, in our blind pursuit of knowledge, had turned the key. The monstrous shape in the sky began to descend, slowly, inexorably, casting a long, dark shadow over the desert. The ground trembled beneath our feet, the air crackled with unseen energy. The ancient glyphs on the fallen shard pulsed with an unholy light. Maria looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. We were trapped, caught in a cosmic horror we couldn't comprehend, let alone escape. The whispers of the dust had been answered, and the sky had responded. The monstrous shape continued its descent, its shadow engulfing us, swallowing us whole. And in the chilling silence that followed, I knew, with a terrible certainty, that the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. Part 19. the whispers grow louder. The dust settled, revealing a landscape scarred anew. The Nazca Lines, once elegant and mysterious, now bore the ugly marks of our desperate attempts to erase them. But the silence that followed wasn't the silence of victory. It was the silence of held breath, of anticipation. The wind picked up, whistling through the defaced geoglyphs, carrying with it a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate in our very bones. Javier, his face ashen, stumbled back from the edge of the newly bulldozed trench. It's still there," he stammered, pointing a trembling finger towards the ground. We crowded around him, peering at the disturbed earth. Despite the gouged earth and displaced rocks, the faint outline of the hummingbird, though broken and fragmented, was still perceptible. It was as if the very earth refused to let go of the image. The hum intensified, accompanied now by a faint, rhythmic pulsing that emanated from the ground beneath our feet. "We have to get out of here," Maria whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "We've made it angry, but it was too late." The pulsing grew stronger, faster, morphing into a series of distinct thuds, like a gigantic heart beating beneath the desert. The ground began to tremble, and fissures snaked across the plateau, spider webbing outwards from the defaced hummingbird. The air crackled with static electricity, and the hair on our arms stood on end. Then, the whispers began. At first, they were barely audible, carried on the wind, a sibilant murmuring that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But they grew steadily louder, more insistent, weaving themselves into the rhythmic thudding, a chorus of inhuman voices rising from the depths of the earth. They weren't words, not in any language we recognized. They were more like concepts, raw emotions, a torrent of alien thought flooding into our minds. Fear, displeasure, hunger. The sky, previously a clear, vibrant blue, began to darken, the stars blinking into existence prematurely. A strange, iridescent shimmer pulsed in the air above us, as if the very fabric of reality was thinning. And through that shimmering veil, we saw them. Shapes. Vast, incomprehensible shapes, drifting in the upper atmosphere. They were unlike anything we had ever seen before, defying description with their impossible geometries and shifting, iridescent colors. They were colossal, dwarfing even the largest of the Nazca Lines, and they moved with a slow, deliberate grace that belied their immense size. The whispers intensified, becoming a deafening roar inside our heads. The ground shook violently, and the fissures widened, spewing forth clouds of dust and a strange, phosphorescent gas that clung to the ground like a living thing. Panic erupted. The soldiers, their discipline finally broken, screamed and fired their weapons wildly into the sky, the bullets disappearing harmlessly into the shimmering veil. The scientists, their rational minds overwhelmed by the sheer terror of the unfolding events, sobbed uncontrollably, clutching at each other for comfort. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. The whispers were inside me now, tearing at my sanity, revealing glimpses of a reality beyond human comprehension. I saw vast, alien landscapes, swirling nebulas of color and light, impossible architectures reaching towards an infinite, star-strewn void. I saw them, the beings to whom the Nazca Lines were a message, a beacon, a summoning. They were not benevolent. The shimmering veil ripped open, and the first of the shapes descended. It was a colossal, amorphous mass of iridescent light, pulsing and shifting with an internal energy that seemed to warp the very air around it. Tendrils of light snaked out from its form, reaching towards the ground, towards us. One of the soldiers, driven mad by terror, charged towards the descending shape, screaming incoherently. He was enveloped by a tendril of light, and his screams were abruptly cut off. For a moment, he hung suspended in the air, his body glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light. Then, with a sickening pop, he vanished, leaving nothing behind but a faint wisp of phosphorescent smoke. The whispers reached a crescendo, drowning out all other sounds. The ground beneath our feet buckled and heaved, and the sky pulsed with the arrival of more shapes, descending like predatory birds upon their prey. We had erased the lines, thinking we could silence the message. But we had only amplified it. We had drawn their attention, not averted it. And now, they were here. To be continued? Part 20. The Whispers of the Dust. The echoing silence that followed Isabella's scream was more terrifying than the scream itself. The dust, stirred by the wind and the tremors, swirled around us, clinging to our clothes and stinging our eyes. It tasted metallic, like old blood. We strained to see through the swirling ochre cloud, but the forms that had emerged from the geoglyph were gone. Vanished, as if swallowed back into the earth. But the fear, thick and suffocating, remained. Isabella? Father Mateo's voice was a choked whisper. He reached out a trembling hand towards where she had stood. There was nothing there but disturbed dust and the faint impression of a struggle. A single, ornate silver earring lay half buried in the sand. It was shaped like a hummingbird, its wings outstretched in perpetual flight. They took her, Javier breathed, his face ashen. They took her back to the sky. The ground beneath our feet rumbled again, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very core of the planet. The Nazca Lines, once familiar and almost comforting in their strange beauty, now seemed sinister, malevolent. They were not messages, but summoning sigils, etched into the earth to call forth something ancient and terrible. We stumbled back towards the jeep, our movements clumsy with fear. The sun, a blood-red orb in the dust-choked sky, cast long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed around us. The wind howled, carrying whispers that seemed to slither into our ears. They were not in any language we knew, but they resonated with a primal dread, a chilling premonition of doom. Back at the camp, the remaining researchers were huddled together, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and disbelief. They had witnessed the dust cloud, the tremors, the disappearance. No one spoke of what they had seen, but their eyes held a shared terror. We were not alone in our knowledge. The sky had been watching, and it had taken what it wanted. The whispers continued, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to emanate from the dust itself, from the very air we breathed. We tried to block them out, to rationalize what we had seen, but the fear was a living thing, coiling around our hearts, squeezing the breath from our lungs. That night, under a sky choked with dust and devoid of stars, we sat huddled around a dying fire. The whispers were a constant presence, a chilling chorus that permeated the silence. We spoke in hushed tones, recounting the events of the day, trying to make sense of the impossible. The glyphs, they weren't meant for us, Father Mateo murmured, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames. They were meant for something else. Something beyond. The legends, Javier whispered, his voice barely audible. The stories of the star people, they weren't just stories. The whispers intensified, swirling around us like a vortex of fear. We could almost feel a presence, something vast and ancient, watching us from the dust-filled sky. The air grew heavy, oppressive. We could barely breathe. Suddenly, the ground beneath us began to shake violently. The tremors were stronger this time, more insistent. Cracks appeared in the earth, spider webbing across the desert floor. The camp was in chaos. People screamed, scrambling to their feet, desperate to escape the unfolding nightmare. Then, we saw them. Emerging from the dust, silhouetted against the blood-red sky, were the figures. They were taller than any human, their forms elongated and distorted, their limbs impossibly thin. Their skin shimmered with an otherworldly luminescence, like polished obsidian. They moved with an unnatural grace, their movements fluid and silent. The whispers reached a crescendo, a deafening cacophony of sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of reality. The figures raised their arms towards the sky, their long, skeletal fingers outstretched. And as they did, the dust began to swirl around them, forming a vortex that reached up into the heavens. A blinding light erupted from the vortex, illuminating the desert with an unearthly glow. The air crackled with energy. The ground beneath our feet seemed to dissolve. We were being pulled upwards, drawn into the vortex, towards the waiting figures and the terrifying unknown that awaited us in the sky. The last thing I saw, before the light consumed me, was Father Mateo's face, his eyes wide with terror, his lips moving in silent prayer. The whispers were the last thing I heard, echoing in my mind, a chilling promise of what was to come. We had sought to communicate with the sky, and the sky had answered. Part 21. Whispers of Dust. The silence that followed the glyph's illumination was heavier than the Andean night. It pressed down, not just on our chests, but on our souls, a tangible manifestation of dread. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, leaving the dust devils to dance in unnerving stillness. We stood frozen, staring at the glowing lines, waiting for something. Maria, her face ashen, gripped my arm. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the faint, high-pitched whine that now emanated from the glyph. The sound grew, twisting into a discordant chorus, grating against our sanity like fingernails on a chalkboard. I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. The ground beneath our feet began to vibrate subtly. The whine morphed, taking on a rhythmic pulse, a deep, resonating thrum that seemed to sync with our heartbeats, forcing them to quicken in panicked response. Then, the stars began to shift. Not twinkle, not shimmer, but shift. They moved against the backdrop of the night sky, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, tracing impossible patterns, drawing lines and curves that echoed the glyphs etched into the desert floor. It was a celestial ballet of terrifying grandeur, a spectacle of cosmic horror that transcended comprehension. The whining reached a crescendo, and from the center of the illuminated glyph, a pillar of light erupted, stabbing into the sky. It was a sickly, pulsating green, tinged with an unsettling violet, like the bruised flesh of a dying god. The shifting stars coalesced around the pillar, spiraling downwards, their light merging with the green glow, creating a vortex of unimaginable energy. "We have to go," I shouted, pulling Maria away from the mesmerizing spectacle. My words were swallowed by the roaring wind that suddenly sprang up, whipping dust and sand into a blinding vortex around us. The ground shuddered violently, and deep fissures opened in the earth, spitting out plumes of acrid smoke. We stumbled through the swirling dust, the earth heaving beneath us like a dying beast. The air crackled with an unnatural energy, and the stench of ozone filled our nostrils. Behind us, the roar of the vortex intensified, and the ground trembled with renewed force. We ran blindly, propelled by pure terror. I didn't know where we were going, only that we had to get away, as far as possible from the monstrous thing we had unleashed. We stumbled into a ravine, seeking shelter from the wind and the blinding dust. Huddled against the rocky wall, we watched in horrified fascination as the vortex continued to grow, reaching towards the heavens like a grasping hand. The stars, now swirling with dizzying speed, began to disappear, swallowed by the green void. Then, from within the vortex, a shape began to emerge. It was vast, incomprehensible, its form constantly shifting and reforming within the swirling light. It defied description, a grotesque mockery of geometry and biology. It was a being of pure energy, of twisted light and shadow, and as it coalesced, a sense of oppressive dread, more profound than anything I had ever experienced, washed over me. It was looking at us. I knew it, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. Despite its lack of discernible features, I could feel its gaze, cold and calculating, probing our minds, dissecting our souls. It was a gaze that spanned millennia, a gaze that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, a gaze that had orchestrated the carving of these very lines into the earth. A low, guttural sound emanated from the vortex, a sound that resonated not just in our ears but in the very fabric of our being. It was a language older than humanity, a language of cosmic horror and unimaginable power. It spoke of ancient pacts and forgotten gods, of a hunger that spanned the stars. Maria whimpered, burying her face in my shoulder. I held her close, trying to offer comfort, but my own terror was too overwhelming. I knew, with a dreadful certainty, that we had made a terrible mistake. We had opened a door that should have remained sealed, unleashed a power that we could not comprehend, let alone control. The being in the vortex began to descend, its form solidifying, becoming more defined, more terrifying. Its lower extremities, if they could be called that, resembled vast, writhing tentacles of light, reaching towards the earth. Its upper portion pulsed and shimmered, a swirling mass of green and violet energy, within which faint, fleeting glimpses of something truly monstrous could be seen. As it descended, the ground shook with increasing violence, and the ravine began to collapse around us. Rocks tumbled down, burying us in darkness. The last thing I saw before the world went black was the blinding green light, and the monstrous shape descending upon us, its silent promise of oblivion. We had whispered to the sky, and the sky had answered. Part 22. Whispers of the Depths. The echoing silence after the tremor was more unnerving than the quake itself. The dust settled, revealing the Nazca Lines, now subtly different. The hummingbird's beak seemed longer. The monkey's tail had curled further. Subtle shifts, easily dismissed as tricks of the light, but I knew better. They were moving, rearranging themselves, responding to something. Elena, her face pale and streaked with dust, gripped my arm. We need to leave, now, but where could we go? The desert stretched around us, an endless canvas for the alien architects. Even the familiar landmarks, the distant peaks, the dried riverbeds, felt tainted, observed. We made our way back to the camp, the ground unnervingly soft underfoot. The others were in varying states of shock. Javier, usually stoic, muttered prayers in Quechua. Maria sobbed silently, clutching a small crucifix. Even Professor Ramirez, the ever-rational scientist, seemed shaken to his core. They're communicating, he whispered, his eyes fixed on the sky, now a bruised purple as twilight deepened. They're preparing. Preparing for what? The question hung heavy in the air, thicker than the desert dust. We huddled around the dying embers of the fire, the flickering flames casting grotesque shadows that danced with the shapes in the sand. Suddenly, Javier pointed a trembling finger towards the spider figure etched onto the plateau. Look. A faint, phosphorescent glow emanated from the lines. It pulsed, rhythmically, like a heartbeat. The glow spread, spiderweb-like, across the desert floor, illuminating the other figures. The hummingbird, the monkey, the condor, all bathed in an unearthly light. It's beautiful, Maria breathed, a strange, hypnotic tone in her voice. Beautiful, and terrifying. The light intensified, illuminating the sky, casting a sickly green glow on the low-hanging clouds. The air crackled with static, and a low hum vibrated through the ground, resonating deep within our bones. Then, the whispers started. Not audible whispers, not at first. It was more a sensation, a pressure against the eardrums, a tingling at the base of the skull. A sense of being addressed. Elena clutched her head, her eyes wide with terror. I can feel it. Something's trying to get in. The whispers grew stronger, coalescing into a chorus of dissonant voices. They spoke in a language we couldn't comprehend, yet somehow, we understood. They spoke of vast distances, of cosmic horrors, of ancient pacts and forgotten gods. They spoke of a coming convergence, a reunion between earth and sky. Professor Ramirez, his eyes glazed over, began to chant in a language I'd never heard before. It sounded ancient, guttural, resonating with the whispers in the air. He swayed back and forth, his arms outstretched as if embracing the unseen presence. Maria joined him, her sobs replaced by an eerie, melodic humming. One by one, the others succumbed, their faces blank, their movements mechanical. They were being puppeted, their minds overtaken by the whispers from the sky. Only Elena and I remained untouched, clinging to our sanity as the world around us unraveled. We watched in horror as our companions, our friends, transformed into hollow shells, their eyes vacant, their mouths moving in silent recitation of the alien language. We have to get out of here, Elena whispered, her voice strained. Before it takes us to. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. But where could we go? The desert was alive with the whispers, the ground thrumming with the impending arrival. The Nazca Lines, once enigmatic symbols, were now glowing beacons, guiding something, down. As we stumbled back, away from the hypnotic glow and the chanting figures, a new sound joined the chorus of whispers. A low, guttural growl, emanating from the depths of the earth. The ground beneath our feet trembled again, this time more violently. Fissures snaked across the desert floor, glowing with the same unearthly light. And then, we saw it. Rising from the largest fissure, a colossal shape began to emerge. It was dark, impossibly vast, blotting out the stars. Its form was indistinct, shifting and swirling like smoke, yet we could sense its immense power, its alien malevolence. The whispers intensified, coalescing into a single, deafening roar. The ground split open beneath us, and the earth swallowed the chanting figures whole. Elena screamed, reaching out for me as the ground gave way. I lunged, grabbing her hand just as she slipped into the abyss. Dangling precariously over the edge, I looked down into the glowing chasm, into the heart of the earth. And in that terrifying glimpse, I saw them. The others, bathed in the unearthly light, their faces contorted in expressions of ecstatic horror. They were no longer human. They were something else. The colossal shape in the sky descended further, its shadow engulfing the desert. The whispers, the growls, the tremors, all intensified, merging into a cacophony of cosmic dread. And as I felt Elena's grip loosen, as I felt myself slipping into the abyss, I knew. The Nazca Lines weren't meant to communicate with the sky. They were meant to open it. Part 23. The Whispering Dust. The earth shuddered, a low groan escaping its parched lips. The crimson glow intensified, pulsating like a diseased heart. The humming resonated deeper now, no longer just in our ears but in the very marrow of our bones. The air crackled with an unseen energy, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We were trapped, caught between a monstrous awakening and the chilling indifference of the vast, star-strewn sky. Elena clung to my arm, her face pale and drawn. She muttered prayers in a language I didn't understand, her voice a trembling whisper against the rising cacophony. Father Dominguez, however, stood rigid, his eyes fixed on the crimson light, a strange, almost expectant expression on his face. The lines, once inert etchings in the desert floor, pulsed with a malevolent energy, like veins filled with liquid fire. "It has heard," Dominguez whispered, his voice barely audible above the humming. "Our offering has been accepted." "An offering?" My blood ran cold. What offering? I looked at him, a question forming on my lips, but before I could speak, the ground beneath us lurched violently. Elena screamed, and I stumbled, grabbing her hand to keep her from falling. The crimson glow reached its apex, blinding us with its intensity. Then, with a sound like 1,000 cracking whips, the earth split open. The fissure snaked across the desert floor, following the path of one of the larger Nazca Lines, the hummingbird. From within the chasm, a searing heat radiated outwards, carrying with it the stench of sulfur and something else, something ancient and indescribably foul. The humming intensified, morphing into a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth. Dominguez, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of fear and awe, began to chant in Latin. I couldn't understand the words, but the intonation sent shivers down my spine. It wasn't a prayer, not anymore. It was an invocation, a summoning. He was speaking to whatever monstrous entity lay beneath the Nazca Lines. The ground continued to tremble, the fissure widening, revealing a glimpse into the fiery abyss below. The crimson light pulsed faster, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the surrounding desert. Then, slowly, something began to rise from the chasm. It wasn't a singular entity, but a swirling mass of dust and shadow, taking shape and dissipating in a grotesque, ever-shifting dance. Within the dust, I could make out fleeting glimpses of things. Faces, contorted in agony. Limbs, twisted and broken. Shapes that defied description, alien and horrifying. They writhed within the swirling vortex, their silent screams echoing in the humming that now filled the air. Elena sobbed, burying her face in my shoulder. I held her tight, my heart pounding against my ribs. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, facing the unimaginable horror that was rising before us. But my feet felt rooted to the spot, my gaze transfixed by the swirling dust. The dust began to settle, coalescing into a vaguely humanoid form. It towered over us, a colossal figure of shadow and dust, its edges constantly shifting, its features impossible to discern. The humming intensified, becoming a chorus of whispers, voices that seemed to claw at the edges of my sanity. They spoke in a language older than time, a language of madness and despair. Dominguez fell to his knees, his chanting ceasing abruptly. He looked up at the towering figure, his face a mask of terror. It has come, he whispered, his voice choked with fear. The sky gods have answered. The figure of dust and shadow extended a hand towards us, a colossal limb composed of swirling particles. The whispers intensified, the voices growing louder, more insistent. They spoke of promises and power, of a new world order, of a reign of darkness that would last for eternity. I knew then what Dominguez's offering had been. It wasn't some symbolic gesture. It was us. He had offered us, our lives, our souls, to appease these sky gods. He had lured us here, to this desolate place, to be the first sacrifices in their unholy reign. The giant hand descended, the whispers coalescing into a single, deafening roar. I closed my eyes, pulling Elena closer, bracing for the inevitable. The heat intensified, the stench of sulfur filling my nostrils. The ground trembled violently, and then, silence. A chilling, absolute silence. I opened my eyes slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The hand was gone. The figure of dust and shadow had dissipated, leaving only a lingering haze of crimson light and the echoing whispers that seemed to burrow into my mind. The fissure in the earth remained, a gaping maw leading down into the fiery abyss. Dominguez lay prostrate on the ground, his body convulsing. He was mumbling incoherently, his eyes wide with a vacant, unseeing stare. He was gone, his mind shattered by the encounter. Elena clung to me, her body trembling. We were alive, but at what cost? The sky gods had answered, and the world would never be the same. The whispering dust had settled, but the terror remained, a chilling premonition of the darkness that was yet to come. The humming intensified, a vibration that seemed to emanate not just from the air, but from the very ground beneath our feet. The dust devils whipped around us with increasing frenzy, their spirals tightening, their forms darkening as if absorbing the fading light. The Nazca Lines themselves, etched deep into the earth, pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence, a sickly green that mirrored the sickly green tinge that had overtaken the sky. Elena clutched my arm, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the growing din. I looked at the glyphs, now glowing with an unsettling vitality, and understood. They weren't just messages, they were a beacon, a landing strip, an invitation. An invitation we had foolishly reactivated. The first shape emerged from the churning clouds like a tear in the fabric of reality. It wasn't a defined object, more a distortion, a warping of the very air itself. Then, slowly, agonizingly, a form began to coalesce. Vast, segmented, and utterly alien. Its limbs, if they could be called limbs, were like elongated, obsidian needles, flexing and contracting with a grotesque fluidity. Its body, an amorphous mass of shifting shadows, seemed to absorb and reflect the unnatural green light, pulsing with an internal rhythm that echoed the humming in our bones. More shapes began to emerge, each one different, yet all sharing that same unsettling alienness. Some were insectoid, with shimmering chitinous carapaces and multifaceted eyes that glittered like malevolent jewels. Others were amorphous blobs of pulsating protoplasm, their surfaces constantly shifting and reforming. And there were others still, forms so alien, so far removed from anything terrestrial, that my mind struggled to comprehend their very existence. The humming became a roar, the wind a howling gale. The ground trembled, the Nazca Lines glowing ever brighter, their green light casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed around us like phantoms. Elena screamed, a high-pitched, desperate sound swallowed by the cacophony. I wanted to scream too, but terror had frozen my vocal cords. The first creature descended, its vast, needle-like limbs reaching out like grasping claws. It landed with a sickening thud that shook the earth, its shadow enveloping us in a shroud of icy dread. Its form, now closer, was even more horrifying. I could see intricate patterns etched into its obsidian skin, patterns that shifted and pulsed like the lines on the Nazca Plateau, patterns that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. And from its amorphous body, I could hear a low, guttural growl, a sound that vibrated deep within my chest, a sound that spoke of ancient hunger and unimaginable power. Other creatures began to descend, landing around us, forming a grotesque circle. We were trapped, surrounded by nightmares made flesh. I looked at Elena, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide with uncomprehending terror. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be all right, but I knew it wouldn't. We had unleashed something ancient, something powerful, something that humanity was never meant to encounter. The creatures began to move, their movements slow and deliberate, yet filled with a chilling purpose. They closed in on us, their shadows merging, swallowing us in a sea of darkness. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But the expected pain didn't come. Instead, I felt a strange pressure, a sensation of being pulled, of being stretched, of being absorbed. I opened my eyes, but the world around me was no longer the familiar desert landscape. Instead, I was surrounded by a swirling vortex of colors, shapes, and sounds that defied comprehension. I saw visions of distant stars, of alien landscapes, of civilizations so advanced, so alien, that they seemed to exist on a plane of reality beyond human understanding. And then, I understood. The Nazca Lines weren't just a message, they were a conduit, a portal. We hadn't just summoned these creatures, we had opened a gateway to a realm beyond human comprehension. A realm where the laws of physics bent and broke, where time and space held no meaning, where the very fabric of reality was woven from the threads of nightmares. Elena was beside me, her eyes wide with the same bewilderment, the same horrifying realization. We were being drawn into this alien realm, pulled towards an unknown destiny. I reached out for her, wanting to hold her, to comfort her, but my hand passed through hers, intangible, spectral. We were no longer truly physical beings, but echoes, shadows, caught in the currents of this cosmic maelstrom. The visions intensified, the sounds grew louder, the colors brighter, until they became a blinding, deafening cacophony that threatened to shatter my sanity. And then, just as I thought I could take no more, it stopped. The swirling vortex subsided, the colors faded, the sounds died away. I found myself standing on a vast, desolate plain, beneath the sky filled with twin suns. The air was thin and cold, and the ground beneath my feet was hard and unforgiving. Elena stood beside me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and wonder. We were no longer on Earth. We were somewhere else, somewhere beyond. And as I looked up at the alien sky, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that we were not alone. The creatures were here, watching us, waiting for us. And our journey had only just begun. The humming intensified, a physical vibration that burrowed into my bones. The air shimmered above the etched plateau, twisting the distorted constellations into a sickening kaleidoscope. Elena, her eyes wide and vacant, clutched my hand, her grip bone-crushing. The wind whipped around us, carrying whispers that weren't whispers. They were thoughts, alien and vast, brushing against the edges of my sanity. The ground began to tremble. Fissures snaked across the desert floor, glowing with an internal, unearthly light. The Nazca Lines themselves seemed to writhe, the etched figures shifting, distorting into grotesque parodies of their original forms. The hummingbird became a skeletal, winged horror. The monkey, a multi-limbed monstrosity. And then, it began. The sky tore open. Not with a bang, not with a flash of light, but with a slow, sickening peal. The stars behind it weren't stars at all, but cold, unblinking eyes. The void that revealed itself wasn't empty, but teeming with a darkness so profound it swallowed the light around it. From this tear in reality, something emerged. It wasn't a single entity, but a swarm, a writhing mass of inky blackness that coalesced into shapes that defied description. Geometric impossibilities, shifting, pulsating horrors that seemed to exist in more dimensions than our minds could comprehend. They poured out of the rift like smoke, yet possessed a terrifying solidity. The humming escalated into a deafening roar. The ground buckled beneath us, throwing Elena and me to our knees. The wind screamed, a chorus of 1,000 lost souls. And through it all, those alien thoughts pressed in, suffocating, invasive, revealing truths that should have remained hidden. They weren't just communicating with the sky. They were summoning it. The creatures, the things from beyond the stars, descended upon the Nazca Lines, drawn to them like moths to a flame. They flowed over the etched figures, their darkness seeping into the earth, corrupting, transforming. The lines began to glow, pulsating with the same unnatural light that emanated from the rift. They were no longer mere drawings in the dirt. They were conduits, channels for a power beyond human comprehension. Elena started to speak, but it wasn't her voice. It was a guttural, rasping sound, filled with syllables that had never been uttered by human tongue. Her eyes, still wide, reflected the swirling chaos of the sky, the alien geometries of the creatures. She was a vessel, a conduit just like the lines themselves. I tried to reach for her, to pull her back, but the ground bucked again, throwing me away. The creatures swarmed around her, their forms shifting, coalescing, becoming something human-shaped. Something familiar. It was Father Ramon, but not the frail, kind priest I had met. This was a mockery, a grotesque imitation. His eyes burned with the same cold fire as the creatures, his skin stretched taut over an alien frame. He smiled, a chilling, predatory grin that stretched his lips too wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. He spoke, and it was Elena's voice, twisted and corrupted, echoing with the alien thoughts that now consumed her mind. They heard the call, the voice hissed. They have come to claim what is theirs. The ground beneath us dissolved. The world fractured. The sky, the earth, the very fabric of reality unraveled, consumed by the darkness that poured from the rift. I fell, tumbling into an abyss of nothingness, the screams of the wind, the roar of the creatures, the alien thoughts all blending into a cacophony of terror. And then, silence. A cold, empty silence that stretched on for an eternity. I opened my eyes to darkness, absolute and unending. There were no stars, no sky, no earth. Just the void. And the thoughts. They were inside me now, a part of me. I understood. I knew. The Nazca Lines weren't a message. They weren't a warning. They were a key. A key that had unlocked a door humanity was never meant to open. And now, we were paying the price. The last vestiges of my sanity crumbled, replaced by the cold, alien logic of the creatures. I understood their purpose, their hunger, their desire to consume and reshape. And I understood my role. I was the inheritor, the vessel, the new conduit. The darkness coalesced around me, shaping itself, reforming. I felt my skin stretch, my bones shift, my mind expand to encompass the vastness of their alien consciousness. And then, I spoke. Not with my voice, but with theirs. A silent scream that echoed across the void, a promise of what was to come. The Nazca Lines had spoken to the sky. And the sky had answered. The end.